Hello and welcome to Learn English with Podcast, a program designed to help learners develop English skills slowly, clearly, and with confidence. This podcast is for those who want to remember English words more easily, use them naturally, and reduce the frustration of forgetting vocabulary after dedicated study. The aim is to provide step-by-step guidance in a calm and structured way, allowing listeners to listen, repeat, and gradually integrate English into daily life. This episode focuses on a common challenge: retaining English vocabulary over time. Many learners experience motivation and progress when studying new words, only to find that those words fade after a few days. This experience can be discouraging, but it does not reflect a lack of ability. It usually indicates that the learning method did not support long-term memory. This episode explains how to remember English words naturally, without pressure, extensive memorization, or mental strain. The approach relies on shadowing, slow and clear-spoken English, and simple daily habits that support retention. The pace is intentionally measured to make it easy to follow and repeat. Understanding every detail immediately is not required. The focus is on listening, maintaining attention, and allowing the language to settle gradually. One fundamental principle is that the human brain does not retain isolated words efficiently. Memory is strengthened by stories, sounds, emotional context, and repeated exposure. This explains why vocabulary learned only through notebooks or direct translation is often forgotten. English words function as tools used in communication, not as isolated units of information. They require context, sound, and regular use. When a word is heard repeatedly, spoken aloud, and applied in real situations, it becomes familiar. This process mirrors how native speakers acquire language and forms the basis of effective learning. A central concept in vocabulary retention is frequency of exposure. Words that are heard often are easier to remember. Regular listening is therefore essential. Daily exposure to English helps the brain become familiar with vocabulary, pronunciation, and sentence patterns. Even when full comprehension is not achieved, the brain continues to process sound and structure in the background. This passive learning supports long-term memory and builds a foundation for active use. A practical way to apply this principle is to listen to English podcasts consistently, even for short periods. Listening during routine activities such as walking, cooking, or resting allows language exposure without additional effort. Frequent pauses and constant translation are unnecessary. Over time, repeated exposure makes words feel familiar rather than new. Familiarity significantly reduces the likelihood of forgetting. Another effective technique is shadowing. Shadowing involves listening to spoken English and repeating it immediately or shortly afterward, matching the speaker's pronunciation, rhythm, and pace. This method engages listening, speaking, and cognitive processing simultaneously, which strengthens memory connections. Words that are only read tend to remain weak in memory, while words that are spoken aloud become more firmly established. Regular shadowing practice reinforces not only meaning but also sound and physical articulation. This combination makes vocabulary recall faster and more reliable. Even short daily sessions can improve the ability to access words naturally during speech. A common obstacle in vocabulary learning is attempting to study too many words at once. Large vocabulary lists can overwhelm the brain and reduce retention. Learning a smaller number of words and using them repeatedly is far more effective. When a word is heard, spoken, written, and thought about in different contexts, it becomes part of active vocabulary. Active vocabulary is significantly more resistant to forgetting. Thinking directly in English is another important habit. Translation slows processing and weakens memory connections. When thoughts are formed directly in English, words are linked more closely to real experiences. Starting with simple internal statements related to daily activities helps create this connection. Over time, speaking these thoughts aloud further strengthens memory pathways. Words associated with lived experience are easier to retain. Learning words within complete sentences also improves retention. Individual words are fragile in memory, while words used in sentences are more stable. Sentences provide structure, meaning, and context, allowing vocabulary to remain flexible and usable. Repeating and slightly modifying sentences helps words remain active rather than static. Repetition remains essential, but it must be varied. Effective repetition involves encountering the same word through listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Each exposure reinforces the word's importance to the brain. Writing short daily entries using familiar vocabulary can support this process without adding pressure. Similarly, recording short voice messages encourages active use and self-awareness. Hearing one's own speech reinforces familiarity and builds confidence. Emotional state also influences memory. Stress interferes with retention, while calm and enjoyment support it. Learning through podcasts, stories, and everyday topics creates a relaxed environment that allows words to settle naturally. Choosing topics that align with personal interests further increases engagement and memory strength. Consistency is more effective than intensity. Short daily practice maintains contact with the language and keeps vocabulary active. Long breaks allow words to fade, while regular exposure sustains familiarity. Reviewing without pressure, such as re-listening to previous material, often reveals that many words are retained without conscious effort. Using English in everyday environments extends exposure beyond formal study. Adjusting device settings, reading simple captions, and watching short English videos increase contact with the language. Each encounter reinforces memory. Occasional forgetting is normal and does not indicate failure. The objective is to make recall easier and faster with repeated exposure. Language learning is a gradual process. Each instance of listening, repeating, or thinking in English contributes to a stronger foundation. Words are retained when they are heard frequently, spoken aloud, applied in real situations, and learned in a calm, consistent manner. Shadowing supports memory, slow practice builds confidence, and small daily habits lead to lasting results. A program designed to help learners develop English skills in a slow, clear, and steady way. This podcast is created for those who want to remember English words effectively, use them with confidence, and avoid the common frustration of forgetting vocabulary after investing time and effort into study. The approach used here is structured, calm, and practical, allowing listeners to absorb English naturally through consistent exposure and repetition. In this episode, the focus remains on how to retain English vocabulary over the long term, using methods that align with how memory functions in real-life language use rather than short-term memorization. Many learners experience the same pattern. They study new vocabulary, feel motivated, and see progress at first. Over time, however, much of that vocabulary fades. This experience often leads to doubt and discouragement. The issue is not a lack of ability or effort. In most cases, the issue lies in how vocabulary is learned. Language retention depends on exposure, usage, sound recognition, and contextual repetition. Without these elements, even well-studied words tend to disappear. A central principle of long-term vocabulary retention is repeated exposure through listening. When words are heard frequently in meaningful contexts, the brain gradually recognizes them as familiar and relevant. This process does not require conscious effort. Even when comprehension is incomplete, the brain is identifying patterns in pronunciation, rhythm, and usage. Over time, this familiarity reduces the mental effort needed to recall words. Listening regularly, even for short periods, supports this process more effectively than occasional intensive study sessions. Shadowing plays a critical role in strengthening this effect. Shadowing involves listening to spoken English and repeating it either simultaneously or immediately afterward. This method engages multiple cognitive systems at once. The listener hears the sound, produces it physically, and processes it mentally. This combination reinforces memory far more effectively than silent reading or passive listening alone. Words practiced through shadowing are easier to recall because they are connected to both sound and physical articulation. Consistent shadowing practice does not require long sessions. Even a few minutes per day can be sufficient. What matters is regularity. Daily repetition reinforces neural connections associated with pronunciation and meaning. Over time, this leads to faster recall and greater confidence during speaking. Words that are spoken regularly become part of active vocabulary rather than remaining passive knowledge. Another factor that significantly affects retention is the quantity of vocabulary studied at one time. Attempting to learn large numbers of new words in a single session often results in poor retention. The brain prioritizes depth over volume. Learning a small number of words and using them repeatedly in different contexts leads to stronger memory formation. Each word gains multiple associations, making it more accessible during conversation. Using words actively is essential. A word remembered only as a definition remains fragile. A word used in sentences, thoughts, and daily situations becomes durable. For example, a common adjective can be reinforced by applying it to different experiences and contexts. This process transforms vocabulary into functional language. Functional language is far less likely to be forgotten. Thinking in English also contributes to stronger retention. When learners rely heavily on translation, vocabulary remains tied to the native language. This creates an additional mental step during recall, which slows communication and weakens memory. Thinking directly in English connects words to experiences rather than translations. Even simple internal statements about daily activities help reinforce this connection. Over time, this habit reduces reliance on translation and improves fluency. Learning vocabulary through sentences rather than isolated words is another effective strategy. Sentences provide context, structure, and usage patterns. They demonstrate how words interact with grammar and meaning. When a word is learned within a sentence, it becomes part of a larger linguistic unit. This makes recall more natural and accurate. Repeating and slightly modifying sentences further strengthens this process by showing how words adapt to different situations. Repetition remains necessary, but it must be meaningful. Repetition through varied exposure is more effective than rote memorization. Hearing a word in listening material, using it in speech, encountering it in reading, and writing it in short texts all contribute to memory reinforcement. Each form of exposure adds a new layer of understanding. Together, these layers create a stable memory trace. Writing short daily entries in English supports this process. Writing forces active recall and encourages thoughtful word selection. Even simple sentences about daily routines reinforce commonly used vocabulary. Accuracy is less important than consistency. Over time, writing becomes easier, and previously learned words appear more naturally. Recording spoken English is another useful technique. Speaking aloud and listening back increases awareness of pronunciation and fluency. It also reinforces vocabulary through repetition. Hearing one's own voice using English words strengthens familiarity and confidence. This practice helps identify which words are becoming automatic and which still require attention. Emotional engagement also affects memory. Learning in a relaxed and focused state supports retention. Stress and pressure interfere with memory formation. When learners choose content that matches their interests, motivation increases and learning becomes more sustainable. Enjoyable topics naturally encourage repeated exposure, which strengthens vocabulary retention. Consistency is a recurring theme in effective language learning. Short daily practice sessions are more beneficial than infrequent intensive study. Regular exposure keeps vocabulary active and prevents decay. When practice stops for extended periods, recall becomes slower. Maintaining daily contact with English helps keep words accessible. Reviewing previously learned material without pressure is also important. Listening again to familiar content reinforces memory and highlights progress. Words that once required effort begin to feel automatic. This reinforces confidence and encourages continued practice. Incorporating English into daily environments further supports retention. Changing device settings, reading short English texts, and engaging with simple media increase exposure. These small adjustments create frequent contact with the language without requiring additional study time. Exposure in varied contexts reinforces vocabulary naturally. Forgetting occasionally is a normal part of language learning. Even proficient speakers experience moments of recall difficulty. The goal is not perfect memory, but efficient recovery. When a word is encountered again and recognized quickly, learning has occurred. Repeated exposure ensures that forgotten words return more easily each time. Patience is essential throughout this process. Language acquisition is gradual and cumulative. Each listening session, speaking practice, and repetition contributes to long-term progress. Improvements may not be immediately noticeable, but they accumulate steadily over time. Vocabulary retention improves when learners focus on sound as much as meaning. Pronunciation, rhythm, and stress patterns play a role in memory. Words remembered as sounds are easier to recall during speech. Listening and shadowing emphasize these auditory elements, strengthening recall pathways. Using simple and clear input is particularly effective for beginners and intermediate learners. Material spoken at a slower pace allows for better processing and imitation. This clarity supports accurate pronunciation and reinforces correct usage patterns. As familiarity increases, speed and complexity can gradually increase. The role of routine should not be underestimated. Practicing English at the same time each day helps establish a habit. Habits reduce the mental effort required to begin practice, making consistency easier to maintain. Over time, this routine becomes part of daily life rather than a separate task. Focusing on practical vocabulary relevant to daily activities increases usefulness and retention. Words that are regularly applied are reinforced naturally. Learning vocabulary connected to personal experiences creates stronger associations. These associations make recall faster and more reliable. Listening without constant interruption is also important. Pausing frequently to analyze every word can disrupt comprehension and reduce enjoyment. Allowing language to flow supports natural pattern recognition. Over time, understanding improves without conscious effort. Confidence grows as vocabulary becomes more accessible. When learners recognize words quickly and use them accurately, speaking becomes less stressful. This confidence encourages more practice, creating a positive cycle of improvement. Language learning benefits from realistic expectations. Progress is not linear, and periods of slower improvement are normal. Maintaining consistent practice during these periods ensures continued development. Over time, small gains accumulate into noticeable fluency. Shadowing remains one of the most effective tools for integrating vocabulary into active use. By repeating full sentences, learners practice pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary simultaneously. This integrated approach reflects how language is used in real communication. Daily exposure to spoken English helps internalize natural sentence structures. This reduces the need for conscious grammar analysis during speaking. Vocabulary learned in this way is easier to retrieve and use accurately. Using English to describe immediate surroundings reinforces vocabulary connected to real experiences. Naming objects, actions, and feelings in English strengthens associations. These associations are grounded in reality rather than abstract definitions. Maintaining a calm learning environment supports concentration and memory. Quiet listening, focused repetition, and relaxed practice sessions improve retention. Learning becomes more effective when the mind is not distracted or rushed. Revisiting familiar content periodically helps consolidate learning. Content that once seemed difficult becomes easier to understand. This progress demonstrates how repeated exposure builds comprehension and confidence. Vocabulary retention is also supported by noticing patterns. Recognizing how words change form or combine with others improves flexibility. This understanding reduces the need to memorize separate forms and increases adaptability during speaking. Using simple paraphrasing helps reinforce meaning. Expressing the same idea in different ways strengthens understanding and recall. This practice develops linguistic flexibility and reduces dependence on specific phrases. Learning through listening encourages intuitive understanding. Over time, learners develop a sense of what sounds correct. This intuition supports accurate vocabulary usage without conscious analysis. Language learning is most effective when it becomes part of daily life. Integrating English into routines reduces effort and increases exposure. This integration supports long-term retention and steady improvement. Vocabulary learned through meaningful use becomes resilient. Words connected to experiences, emotions, and actions are less likely to fade. These connections create multiple pathways for recall. Maintaining curiosity about language supports continued engagement. Noticing new words in familiar contexts reinforces learning. Curiosity encourages exploration and repeated exposure. Progress in vocabulary retention is cumulative. Each repetition strengthens memory. Each use reinforces confidence. Over time, these small actions result in significant improvement. Effective vocabulary learning relies on sound, context, repetition, and usage. Isolated memorization is insufficient for long-term retention. Integrated practice reflects how language is naturally acquired. Listening daily, shadowing regularly, and using words actively create a stable foundation. This foundation supports both comprehension and speaking ability. Language learning is a gradual process that rewards consistency. Daily practice, even in small amounts, leads to lasting results. Vocabulary retained through regular exposure becomes readily available during communication. By focusing on practical methods and maintaining steady habits, learners can significantly reduce forgetting. Vocabulary becomes familiar, accessible, and usable. This familiarity supports confident communication. English words remain when they are heard frequently, spoken regularly, and connected to real experiences. Slow, clear input combined with repetition and usage creates durable memory. With consistent practice, vocabulary retention improves naturally. Words no longer feel temporary. They become part of everyday expression. This approach emphasizes steady progress rather than rapid accumulation. Over time, learners develop a strong and reliable vocabulary base. Through listening, shadowing, thinking in English, and daily exposure, vocabulary becomes integrated into active language use. This integration supports long-term retention and fluent communication. The process requires patience, consistency, and focused practice. When these elements are present, remembering English words becomes easier and more reliable. In the long term, vocabulary retention reflects how language is used rather than how it is studied. By aligning learning methods with natural language use, learners can achieve lasting improvement. English learning becomes more effective when it is calm, structured, and continuous. Vocabulary retained through these methods supports clear and confident communication. Over time, words that once felt difficult become familiar. Speaking becomes smoother. Understanding improves. These changes reflect the cumulative effect of consistent practice. Language learning remains an ongoing process. Continued exposure and usage ensure that vocabulary stays active. This ongoing engagement supports lifelong improvement. By maintaining daily contact with English and applying practical techniques, learners can significantly reduce forgetting and build lasting fluency. Using English in everyday environments extends exposure beyond formal study. Adjusting device settings, reading simple captions, and watching short English videos increase contact with the language. Each encounter reinforces memory. Occasional forgetting is normal and does not indicate failure. The objective is to make recall easier and faster with repeated exposure. Language learning is a gradual process. Each instance of listening, repeating, or thinking in English contributes to a stronger foundation. Words are retained when they are heard frequently, spoken aloud, applied in real situations, and learned in a calm, consistent manner. Shadowing supports memory, slow practice builds confidence, and small daily habits lead to lasting results.